Good evening. My name is Professor John Polisel from the University of Melbourne. I'd like to welcome you all to the Theodore Fink Memorial Seminar in Australian Education 2021. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay respect to the 5 tribes of the Kulin Nation. I pay respects to the elders of the community and extend our recognition to their descendants. Tonight's seminar is called Workers in Search of an Education, Past, Present, Future. Theodore Fink, for whom this seminar is named, was a lawyer, politician and newspaper proprietor. He had an especially strong interest in Victorian schools, universities and workers' education. It's Fink's focus on the connection between work and education which underlies our seminar this evening. This is a connection that has not always been that obvious. As far back as the 16th century, the Bishop of Exeter argued that the 7 sciences, grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music and astronomy, should be learned only by gentlemen and free men, and not by those who got their living with hand and sweat of the body. Our Bishop of Exeter, who was educated, by the way, at Eton, Oxford and Cambridge, was making the point that education was not about practical or applied learning. It was certainly not about learning how to make money and to work with your hands and your sweat. These were not things that gentlemen did. Women, of course, were not even mentioned. The 7 sciences that underlie his view of education were clearly not seen as having any explicitly vocational function. These views strike us now as old-fashioned and very elitist, but I believe that many of us may still cling to these very traditional views of what education is or what it should be. Our education systems have evolved a lot since the 16th century, and our secondary schools have grown well beyond their classical humanities origins. But in reality, our schools remain focused on providing a pathway mainly into university. Most schools struggle to provide effective practical or applied learning. I think they also find it difficult to understand vocational education, which has a different culture, a culture that's connected to work. Formal education, by way of its traditions, has always been sanctioned by the state or in the past by the church. In this way, it has official and formal status and has been central to nation building. But these were privileges that were long denied to the processes of vocational education, which was always more about teaching narrow, quite specific skills. Or in many cases, it was about teaching working class children to know their place and their role in society. Durkheim described it well. He said that education was about the enculturation of the ruling classes into positions in the church and in government. This was an ancient tradition, formal, known and respected. The vocational tradition, on the other hand, was about the enculturation of the children of the poor to work in unskilled and semi-skilled jobs. Historically, an informal way of learning with little status and only very recently included in our formal systems of education. This is why tonight's exploration of education, defined in much more inclusive terms, is so important. From the first Mechanics Institute, established in Australia in Hobart in 1827, to early attempts to provide more formal education options for young women in institutions like the Emily Macpherson College here in Melbourne, I think that the hunger for education among those traditionally excluded from it has forced our institutions to change. Vocational education has also slowly and painfully sought to establish a place for itself within our secondary and tertiary education institutions. Radical education has sought to address other needs of the disenfranchised, mainly outside of these formal means. From the early 20th century soapbox orators, pub discussions, park meetings, and working class autodidacts, right up until our more recent modes of self-education through online and internet-based platforms. These more inclusive approaches also include trade union training programs established here in Australia in the 1970s to develop the skills and the capacities of workers to engage with their employers on a more equal footing. Tonight's presentation will explore the importance and the impact of these brave initiatives. It will do so in the form of a dialogue between Professor Verity Burgmann and Mr. Max Ogden. Verity Burgmann is an honorary adjunct professor of politics in the School of Social Sciences at Monash University. She's an honorary fellow in history at the University of Melbourne and director of the Reason in Revolt, an online database of primary source documents of Australian radicalism from the mid-19th century to the present day. From 1981 to 2012, she taught at the University of Melbourne, becoming its first female professor of political science in 2003. She's a long-time activist and office bearer in the Public Education Group in Victoria. Her publications focus on radical ideologies, labour movements, environmental politics, and anti-corporate and other protest movements. Max Ogden has enjoyed a 60-year career as a unionist with the AMWU and as an educator and activist. He's been involved in campaigns that shaped Australian society, including against the war in Vietnam and for peace and nuclear disarmament. He has contributed to policy developments on technological transformation, work design, union training, and industrial democracy, and on the changing role of women in the workforce. Max is a partner investigator in an ARC linkage project with the University of Melbourne, RMIT, ACTU, and the Trade Union Education Foundation, researching the history of trade union training in Australia. Joining the dialogue as a moderator between these two giants of Australian activism will be Dr Alice Garner. Alice is a teacher, historian and performer based in the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. She's a member of the interdisciplinary team working on the history of trade union training in Australia. She has a PhD in history from the University of Melbourne and a graduate diploma in secondary education from Victoria University. And finally, Dr Mary Lay will lead a question and answer session at the conclusion of the discussion. Dr Lay has made significant contributions to the development of evidence-based government policy in Australia through commissioned research reports for government and non-government organisations. Her recent research projects have examined transitions between education and employment, the nature of vocational training, young people's decisions about tertiary education, and vocational education and quality vocational teaching. She's the lead chief investigator of an Australian Research Council funded project exploring the history of trade union education in Australia. It's my great pleasure then to welcome Dr Alice Garner, Professor Verity Burgmann and Mr Max Ogden to begin tonight's Theodore Fink Memorial Seminar in Australian Education.
Adult education outside of institutions like schools and universities is our focus today. Past Theodore Fink Memorial lectures have mostly explored the formal Australian education system from early childhood through to tertiary levels. But we're going to move beyond the walls of accredited institutions and have a look at workers' education and radical education. In the context of the ongoing dramatic effects of the coronavirus pandemic on our societies and economies, it seems especially important to look at the ways that people seek to and have sought to expand their understanding of the forces that shape and shake up our lives. So we're going to start by getting a few definitions out of the way, then dive into some history, and then come back to our current day landscape. So Verity, Theodore Fink, who died in 1942, was very interested in the development of technical and workers' education. But what is or was workers' education, and how has it changed since, say, the 19th century?
Well, that's a very difficult question because there's so many different types of workers' education. Fink was clearly particularly interested in what we would describe as vocational education, but there are many other types of workers' education. Firstly, there's the compensatory form of education that was developed particularly in the 19th century, which became possible when workers, one, improved conditions and were able to work shorter hours and therefore did actually have some time to go to classes at night and so on. And these developments were to compensate them for being denied access to mainstream education or restricted in their access to it. Now, of course, in Victoria we've had free and compulsory education since 1872, but even after that there were still huge inequalities of access, and obviously working class people didn't have the sort of access that better off people did. For example, a Newcastle coal miner in the 1880s who started a weekly newspaper, he contrasted his lot with that of the employer's son, who was the same age as him and who had been reckoned a thick-headed dunce at school, whereas he, the coal miner, had won silver medals for proficiency but hadn't been able to go on to secondary school. So that compensatory form of education was particularly important in the 19th century and early 20th century, but then there's also the transformational form of workers' education, which was particularly espoused by those working class men and women who had made that mental leap from accepting the world as it was to believing in a world as it ought to be, and wanted to encourage workers to resist exploitation. And so this is a high point in the late 19th, early 20th century of working class interest in radical transformational ideas, and it's also a time when there's access to cheap literature and so on. It's the time of the autodidact, and Mary Gilmore, for instance, recalls seeing working men on the tram reading Marx and Engels and carrying a dictionary to help them out. Billy Hughes also reminiscence about the capital reading groups of the 1890s that weren't full of left-wing intellectuals, but of working class men and women in laborious labour during the day, but then meeting together of an evening to go through capital or value, price and profit. And of course, socialist organisations were extremely important in providing alternative venues, and we can talk more about that later. And then I suppose another category obviously is the instrumental form of workers' education, which is typically offered by organisations of the labour movement, such as trade unions, and that was particularly important in the latter half of the 20th century when unions were so strong, like for instance in the 1970s with the Trade Union Training Authority, and Max of course knows a lot about that.
Max, what are your thoughts?
First of all, I'll just relate briefly my own experience. I mean, my experience, like so many thousands of others, of learning and work was doing an apprenticeship. And I started mine in 1954 at the SEC, which provided a terrific apprenticeship. And you got a day off a week for the first year, and the next 2 years you got a day off a fortnight to attend the training. And that was a huge advance. Up to then, people, in fact, way back in the days of Tom Mann, for example, they would actually pay to be an apprentice and spend 7 years at it and then study at night time to learn. So time off for learning was an important issue. And there was quite a dramatic action that brought this about. In 1945, the Amalgamated Engineering Union, which I'd come out of later on, a young Laurie Carmichael, along with some other colleagues, mainly from the Eureka Youth League, convened a meeting at the Savoy Hotel on the corner of Collins and Burke Streets, expecting 60 or 70 apprentices to turn up to discuss time off. 1,500 to 2,000 jammed the corner of apprentices. So they couldn't possibly have the meeting in the Savoy, so they marched up to the Trades Hall when those days it had a big space at the back of it, and that was the launch of the really strong demand for time off for learning, for apprenticeships, which was eventually won, and which I was one to enjoy that. But what they tapped into was an extraordinarily strong feeling, which they didn't even realise at the time, how deep it ran about workers, apprentices in particular, backed by tradesmen, I might add, who were keen for them to have that kind of time off and learning.
So that time off would be for actual vocational or technical skills. What about, say, a sort of more political education or learning about economics, or where would people go for that information if they couldn't go to university or they left school early?
Well, they'd establish, as Verity said, some of their own study circles. You had the Labour College, which was originally established by Tom Mann at the Trades Hall, which lasted for many, many years. And then you had the Communist Party and the Eureka Youth League, which I'd come through, which ran regular sessions, group discussions, weekends away, and that's how we started the education in the Metalworkers Union, the AU as it was then. First of all with people like that before we then developed it much bigger. For example, in 1960 I went and spent 3 weeks at Minto and a Communist Party course for 3 weeks, which was fantastic actually. It was like, for somebody like myself, as a working class person, joining the Eureka Youth League and the Communist Party, I've often said from way, way back, was a bit like going to a university for somebody who hadn't experienced that. And then you spent time at a course like that discussing all sorts of fascinating things, philosophy and politics and so on. So there's a fair bit of that, but I'm not sure to what extent, how extensive that was in Australia compared with some other countries, but certainly, and there's not nearly as much of that goes on today.
Actually, let's go back a little bit earlier. Verity, you've done work on the Wobblies and their approach to education. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the ways that education was seen and used.
Well, yes. I mean, firstly and obviously the mechanics institutes that John mentioned in his introduction were very important in the 19th century, and we still see those beautiful old buildings in country towns today. I think there were 1,200 in Victoria in the 19th century, and they were the very obvious first attempts for workers to compensate themselves for not having access to mainstream education. And then as they petered, they kind of declined by early 20th century, partly because of improved access to education, but also because local governments started providing libraries and so on. And then the Workers' Educational Association came along, and that was set up in the UK 1903, started here in 1913. But during the First World War, the Workers' Education Association and the university types that were involved in giving the lectures and so on really became contentious as far as the labour movement activists were concerned, because they started trying to use the Workers' Education Association to promote ideas of social harmony and industrial efficiency, whereas the kind of workers that were wanting to go and get this education were actually more radical. And so a lot of conflict developed, particularly when the WEA middle class professionals decided to support conscription, which labour movement organisations were against. And so that's where the industrial workers of the world started to get really, really angry with the Workers' Education Association, and in fact, and other more transformational institutions such as the Victorian Labour College developed in opposition to the Workers' Education Association. And the industrial workers of the world were even before, well before Antonio Gramsci formulated the problem of hegemony, the industrial workers of the world were producing pamphlets like How Capital Has Hypnotised Society. And they wrestled with the problem of what they called the boneheads, the workers who accepted the capitalist system and didn't realise they were being exploited, and how could the workers become emancipated if they didn't first have education that taught them about how much they were exploited by bosses and so on. And the Wobblies, as they were called their literature and their reading classes and their outdoor oratory mental dynamite. And that was how they wanted to sort of explode the minds of the workers so that they would be educated and realise the extent of their exploitation. And of course the Victorian Socialist Party is another good example. It ran socialist Sunday schools where the workers' children would learn the creed that included the commandments that included things like thou shalt wage class war. And of course the Labour College that Max mentioned is another example of a transformational institution that was prompted by the behaviour of the Workers' Education Association being too conservative, and it was in line with the plebs' league breakaway from Ruskin College in Oxford. The Ruskin College students decided that the teachers were trying to impart middle-class values to workers, whereas the students wanted working-class values to be imparted to workers. And so in 1908, students at Ruskin College went on strike and formed the Plebs League, and that is the origin of the Labour colleges that started up here in opposition to the workers' education model that was seen as too conservative.
How long did the Labour colleges last? When would they have finished up?
Well, they were flourishing in the 20th century. From 1965 onwards, the secretary of the Victorian Labour College was a very interesting Trotskyist by the name of Ted Tripp. And he really believed that the Victorian Labour College, could build a kind of a revolutionary movement amongst workers, and that workers should be particularly wary of becoming involved in mainstream education. They certainly didn't need to go to universities, that institutions like the Labour colleges could give them a much, much better and more useful education that would help them improve society in the interests of everybody in society, and would also equip workers to be able to run the post-capitalist society that could be created through the workers' education movement based on the Labour colleges. And it was still going strong in recent years until Chris Gaffney became ill, and Chris died last year.
Yeah, that's right. One of the interesting lessons that we've learnt when we were kicking off for the first time, well, not the first time, the white-collar unions, particularly AXPAR and the Commonwealth Public Sector unions, were really quite leaders in the field in the mid to late 60s. And I worked with them as part of developing the work at the AMW. Our very first course we ran for shop stewards. In those days we didn't have any funding, and so if a shop steward wanted to come to a course, the members on the job would have to collect their wages for the day. It was just a one-day thing to see how it went, and we expected 40 or 50 to turn up, and nearly 100 rolled up. I remember Laurie Carmichael that day was just over the moon. We had them packed in everywhere, and showed their thirst. And we had Ian Turner as one of the speakers to open up with some labour history. However, what we learnt then as we went along a bit further, and then when we started to really establish the program on a firm financial basis and everything, was that most of the people would come along, of course, overwhelmingly. They wanted to learn some skills. They weren't particularly interested in labour history, despite the fact you got somebody, Ian, who would colourfully present great stuff. Their interest was, how do I negotiate? How do I chair a meeting? how do I write reports, etc., etc. So when we sort of got underway much more substantially from about 72 on, we realised that had to be a big focus. However, we also did that very clearly on the basis of how can you empower our members on the job, particularly the shop stewards, so that they could become every bit as capable as an organiser to handle things without necessarily having to rely on the organiser. So we designed our whole system around that whole idea of empowerment. So it wasn't just the provision of skills, important as that, it was the way we went about it and the sort of the way we presented that as part of their ongoing battle in the workplace. So then, of course, when tutor was announced, we had some concerns whether that would be carried through tutor. And
so, Max, just to say that tutor is short for the Trade Union Training Authority. There might be people who...
Yeah, the Trade Union Training Authority was established by Clyde Cameron through legislation in 1975, although he'd provided quite a lot of money to start the process leading up to that. And I have to say, some very fine people, many of them still very dear friends to this day. And I remember we went and had a yarn with Cameron the week before he was going to present the legislation. And we posed him some of these questions. There was Jim Baird, Bob Bridgerson and myself. And he said, I knew you three would be raising those issues. And I'll never forget, he said, look, I'm going to talk some bullshit in Parliament about how this is all going to be, all the classes coming together. Don't you attack me, because I don't mean it at all. I want to see our members empowered. Anyway, as things went on, we had a good relationship with tutor. Most of the states did a very fine job, and they also had in mind training people to empower them in the workplace, which I might add was not always well received by union officials and union leaders.
Because their own leadership might be threatened by a more democratic structure?
Often weren't happy about us training the shop stewards to be more effective than them.
So taking this idea of sort of what is powerful learning and where does it happen, there's a sense that maybe either universities, for example, were not accessible to many for a long time, but also in some cases people chose not to, or they felt that they weren't going to get the education they wanted from a university. So what kinds of powerful learning were people looking for, and how, what forms did that take outside of the formal institution?
Well, we learnt that we'd take a shop steward through 2 or 3 courses and, improving their abilities all the time.
So this is basically job representatives.
Yeah. But then we'd start to introduce the broader political issues, the class issues, economics and so on, which by then they start to get interested in. And we'd then, they'd go to some of the tutor courses who did some very good work around these kind of bigger issues. And then not many, but a few of them wanted to go beyond that. And so in South Australia we had the postal courses, which had developed quite early on in the mid-60s. They were popular, doing those kind of bigger issues. And then, of course, the Labour Studies Diploma at what was then SAIT, I think. Quite a few went on to that as well.
So that's heading back into the sort of tertiary system in a way, isn't it?
It was, except it was specifically designed for workers, the Labour diploma, as we tried to do here at Swinburne and as it was in the Institute of Technology at Footscray. But we only encouraged a handful of people to go, so we had to abandon.
What about the spaces, the more public spaces where people might go to learn things? Maybe Verity, you could talk a bit about the kind of park meetings or public speaking and those sorts of forums.
Well, that was absolutely crucial. That this is in the days before television, obviously, and even cinema, and you had working class orators who could literally talk for 2 hours and keep audiences spellbound. It was a very, very, very important way in which the agitators who had a clearer understanding of the world were able to impart their knowledge to other people who were just starting to notice that they were being ripped off on the job and the boss wasn't nice to them, and the boss's family lived in mansions and their children were in a hovel and so on. And it was just an extraordinarily liberating experience for workers becoming class conscious through listening to these powerful orators in places like the Yarra Bank or the Sydney Domain, or inside
the trade
halls. Yes, and the
Victorian
the Victorian Socialist Party used to pack out, the Athenaeum. There'd be 2,000 people there of a Sunday evening listening to Tom Mann or Harry Scott Bennett or so on. This was a very, very important form of workers' education, and backed up, of course, by the very, very rigorous schedule that organisations like the socialist parties and the industrial workers of the world ran in terms of reading classes, either based on economics or even, looking at the classics. And, of course, all the pamphlets and the leaflets that they distributed, 1,000 pamphlets a month were distributed in 1904 by the Social Democratic Federation to Labor Party branches in Victoria, especially in the country. So they had a bicycle propaganda corps that used to, take these pamphlets to these, tiny little Labor Party branches in the country. So those socialist organisations and syndicalist organisations and even anarchist organisations were incredibly important in getting this radical literature and radical oratory out to workers who were really, really thirsty for knowledge, not just general knowledge about the humanities and literature and so on, but for knowledge about their place in society and how things were wrong.
And as far as getting access to the materials, I'm thinking about the role of libraries in this, in the pre-internet period. Could you go to your local library and order a copy through the library of a book that might be seen as sort of politically, extreme I'm curious to know about access to...
Well, possibly not, and that's why the Mechanics Institute libraries were important, because they were still there even as the role of the Mechanics Institute education classes declined as we move into the 20th century. They still mostly had libraries that were very, very important for working class activists.
And what about literacy as well? Just in that same sort of, I know with tutor courses, quite often there'd be people coming in from a vast range of educational experiences and backgrounds, and so you needed to work out how to engage people who may not actually be confident with reading but still had a lot of knowledge or a lot of thirst for knowledge as well. So I'm just curious if you could talk a bit to that.
We tried to combat that problem for a while using audio, which we made ourselves about, economics and other issues. So we'd run a course once we were getting beyond just the skills, and we'd have an audio tape that people could take away with them. Not a lot did, but it was, for the period we did it, was of some value. But the other thing that happened was the Trade Union Training Authority centres in each state and Clyde Cameron College were very well equipped with libraries, and part of the things they taught was how to use a library. In particular, at the residential college at Clyde Cameron College, that was a real focus, because a lot of the training was based on project syndicate work, which would require quite deliberately them to use the library, and we had several people there who were well equipped in the library to help people learn how to use the library. So that was just a small contribution to that, but it was quite a conscious contribution. That, for example, we didn't have the same kind of facility to be able to do that in our union. It's, you'd need to have a much bigger approach. Just coming back to that, I mean, it's never been a really high priority in the Anglo-Saxon, but particularly in the Australian union movement. Even in the days when we were at our very peak, we were running so many courses. Quite a few officials still weren't too happy about it. People who'd come through the ranks, never done any training, they said, well, I didn't need that, you know. And so getting the facilities and the resources together were very difficult. What we had to do was to put on a special levy, which we did finally nationally, education levy on the dues, the union dues, so we could have full-time education officers and the facilities and all the teaching equipment and everything. Because in Australia, the union dues have never gone above about 0.7% of salary. Usually they're around about 0.5%. In Scandinavia, they're 2 to 3%, nothing less than 2%, which is a huge difference. And so, for example, Sweden alone has, that I'm familiar with, there might be more, 6 residential colleges, and they're absolutely fantastic. I've been to several of them. And all their education, their biggest single cost to running the union by far is their education system, way ahead of full-time officials, whereas here our biggest single cost is union officials. So, and they've been doing that for 100 years. So it's really right in the guts of everything they do. They never do undertake a major project with first thorough research and then thorough training of their members in a way that, because of our lack of resources and very poor payment of dues, we just can't do it.
And speaking of which, with union density at the low levels that we're experiencing now, I mean, having seen during the pandemic lockdowns and so on, the sort of effects of casualisation and precarious work kind of exposed to all, is there a role still for union education? Can it still meet those needs in the way that it might once have?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I would argue, of course, I suppose I would given my background, but I would argue that that should be the biggest, the education program should be the biggest single cost for unions if they're going to survive in the future. Now, they're doing a fair bit of education training, but nowhere near what's required.
I sometimes feel that there's a bit too much alarm about declining union densities, because if you consider French trade unionism, it's always had low density. Typically, historically, 10% density, and yet the French labour movement is very strong in terms of its ability to disrupt and to improve pay and conditions. So high unionisation levels don't necessarily make unions powerful, because if you're really, really cunning, even in the horrible globalised economy that you have, small workplaces can create complete havoc, like in global supply chains such as automobile manufacture, with that sort of vertical structure. The strike wave in China in 2010 was started by 1,800 workers in a transmission parts factory that held up the entire production of cars in China. So they had educated themselves about the dangers of just-in-time production for corporations and how just a small link in the chain could be broken and bring car manufacturers to their knees. The same tactic was used in Michigan in the 1990s, which was terrible for General Motors and so on.
So these global communities that are sort of connecting up, do you see new forms of education, or are they just a different version of ways of learning that have always existed?
Well, there's a huge number now of websites that bring together sympathetic academics and union activists. They're news aggregation sites, but they also engage in research and an analysis. And that's Global Labour Strategies is one that started in North America in the 1990s to create a community amongst precarious and casual workers. And that used the expertise of sympathetic academics to produce this new community, which they were educating each other and so on. And even they produced an Emmy-nominated documentary film, Global Village or Global Pillage, and so on. And another recent development is the Global Labour University, since early this century, which is sponsored by the International Confederation of Trade Unions that was founded in 2006, and the International Labour Organisation and partner universities. And that runs master's programs for trade union activists in countries around the world, India, Brazil, South Africa, Germany, United States, and so on. And it has thousands of students attending its master's programs in courses such as global labour standards, international development and sustainable development and so on, that equips trade union officials and trade union activists internationally to better cope with the much harsher bargaining conditions that workers are now in globally.
Actually, that raises the question too about once upon a time, you would think of unionists as being people who'd sort of come up from the shop floor, whereas increasingly they will be union officials and leaders will often be people who've come in from having done a university course in that area. Curious to know about your thoughts on that and how, where once there may have been a greater division between universities and workers' education, how that relationship has maybe evolved over time.
Yeah, that is a bit of a problem. There's definitely a lot more people who've come into unions with the best of intentions, I might add. And some very fine people have done that, straight from a university to a research job in a union, and then finish up being the state or federal secretary and so on. And
they've never actually worked on the job.
And I think that is a weakness. Now, having said that, there's a number of those people made a very fine contribution, but in my experience, that lack of understanding what happens actually in a workplace, and in particular, the issue which I hammered for 60 years, I suppose, which has never got nearly enough resonance, is the sheer frustrations and alienation which workers feel every day, and powerlessness, leaving aside wages and conditions, important as they are, that people who haven't experienced that find it difficult to relate to. In all our working life, that's one of the big things. We feel so powerless, we see the boss so incompetent and doing such stupid things, and that you get so angry at the end of the day. And she asked me, why isn't the union doing more about it? Well, I think that's one of the issues which are laying there, which could mobilise workers enormously. But unions seem reluctant to touch it. They focus just on wage and condition. Now, of course, you've got to do that. But this other issue, in all my experience, in fact, just briefly, if there's one session in the shop stewards courses, of which I ran hundreds, when I spend half a day talking about work and explain how surplus value is generated and how Taylorism operates and so on, and no other session ever got anything like the animated discussion that got. And you'd show them how management operated in the division of labour, and people would say, "Oh Christ, now I understand why they do these bloody things." That was always really well received, and so I think that's an issue which and it's partly not entirely by any means, but partly because we've got so many people in the union movement now who have never experienced that, and therefore it's not easy for them to understand.
Verity. The stats have changed over time. In Australia now, about 89% of young people will complete Year 12 and 60% will complete an undergraduate degree. Do you think that this increased access to formal education has killed workers' education, or is there still a need for it in some form?
Look, very much so. Unfortunately, our education system, and ironically the fact that it's now more embracing of more people, actually legitimates inequality. It makes people think that there is equality of opportunity, that we live in a meritocracy, and that because everybody can go to school and finish school in a free education system, that this has sort of solved the problem of injustice and inequality, but unfortunately it hasn't. There are various issues here. Firstly, particularly in Australia, private schooling is overfunded, and this totally means that the education system doesn't allow for mobility or greater equality of opportunity. It actually replicates existing inequalities. There is no equality of opportunity when actual inequalities are so vast. So the problem is that the education system kind of sort of just continues the whole saga of inequality. And this is why in Britain in the 1940s, when the Attlee government brought in its big reforms to education to allow the bright kids of the working class to go to the grammar schools and give them a chance of going to university, that Raymond Williams cautioned against this and the effects that would have on working class culture and working class identity, that the grammar schools that the working class brightest kids would go to would indoctrinate them in middle class values, and they would lose their organic connections with their working class communities. And so he argued for a continuing emphasis on workers' education that was separate from the mainstream, that otherwise there was this risk that working class identity would be diminished, and that this would actually weaken the ability of the labour movement to withstand capitalist ideology and hegemony and so on. And he argued that that's why the labour movements or labour parties have declined. It hasn't been to do with workers becoming bourgeoisified, it's to do with the neglect of institutions such as workers' education that encourage feelings of working class identity. And so the labour movement declines from being a social movement to being merely an alternative power group. So I think, it doesn't mean that workers' education is not important. The problem with greater access to education is it doesn't change the occupational structure. You just mean that the people with the worst jobs are better educated than they used to be. But that doesn't actually help them if they're still in worse jobs. And in fact, if more people are finishing school and even getting degrees, it means that the labour market penalties for the smaller number who don't are even greater than when there were more people not going to university.
Yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question. I'm not sure I agree entirely with Raymond Williams, because the idea of class consciousness is, I think, regardless of a lot of the work we've done in union education, the like, is fast disappearing anyway. And the latest, the polls, recognition of the polling shows, for example, that over the last 40 years, from having a solid sort of working class base of 45% roughly, the ALP and, well, the left generally, that's dwindled now to a solid 20%, whereas the middle class now make up 40 to 45% as the solid, where it only used to be 20%. So we've got this very interesting phenomenon which we could never have predicted, where a lot of just ordinary workers are a basis for conservative votes. You've seen it in the mining fields and the like. You even had a union official in 2019 a union official standing with One Nation as a candidate out of the mining industry. And so that's the other thing, that people who used to be solid Labor Party voters, they've now, and the other problem is there's no evidence whatsoever amongst that grouping of any kind of solidarity with the lower paid. They're very elite workers. They're militant, they're strong, but it's very much just for them. If I could just say a couple of things. One of the issues I think we ought to be thinking a lot more of is paid time off for learning. You know, a number of countries have quite, like in the Nordic countries, Germany, they have quite generous time off for learning. Quite some years ago, we got quite excited with the Italian union movement negotiated, I think it was 3 weeks a year that workers could take off to do learning in whatever field that they wanted. Didn't have to relate it to work. But I think that was lost eventually. I had a very interesting example here where ICI Botany, which was the most frightful place to work, they used to work 48 hours a week every Saturday. Awful place, demoralised place. Drugs and grog were pretty heavy because the place was so appallingly managed and so on. A group of shop stewards, led by a very fine colleague of mine who I got to know as a result, they got together and over a period of about 7 years, a very powerful union group, but they also had a very competent and progressive management. And they were able to negotiate huge changes so that the place went for, it was the worst ICI chemical plant in the world, Max Ogden, and they turned it into the best. And in that process, they brought hours down to 36 a week, and some departments were so efficient, 32 hours a week. And what was interesting was the number of people who then used that time to go and extend their studies in various fields. And it showed that if you link the time, so for example, one of the things I think we should be talking about, as part of the shorter hours, instead of talking about a shorter week, we should be talking about a shorter year, because it's substantial then. So as part of that, we ought to be talking about all workers having access to 100 hours a year for learning, and not just related to their trade or profession, but the arts or whatever. Many years ago, because of the work we were doing in the Union and the Arts with your parents and Max Gillies and so on, we used to do these theatre performances in workplaces, and then on one occasion we ran this very successful metal sculpture exhibition where we had about 40 people put in, most of them from the workplace. And so what they were metal workers who'd begun to learn something about the art side of their trade. And Jimmy Ralston was the chairman of our union at the time and also on the apprenticeship commission. And so we put up a very well worked out proposal that at the end of the apprenticeship there should be an extra 50 hours of training, time off, added on, so that if they wished the end of the apprenticeship, they could then do an art element, like printers might want to do some writing or something like that. Metal workers, anyway. Of course, the employers just jumped on it straight away. But that thinking should be much more in our strategy, and we don't do it as a thing in itself. We do it as an integral part of the whole issue of shorter hours and so on. But again, that's...
And here I suppose you're not talking so much about workers' education in the sense that we've been talking about it perhaps in its earlier incarnations, but access to all forms of education by workers to have that time.
But then I would argue that the union movement could then extend its work along the whole class political lines, and people would have the time to go to them. So we'd be in there as part of the whole process.
But of course, employers don't want workers to have the joys and benefits of, general education. They really only want workers to be trained in the skills that they then employ. So it's a wonderful idea, Max, and will be resisted tooth and nail by employers, as indeed they resisted the development of mechanics institutes.
Of course, nowadays they don't spend much time doing any training anyway.
Well, that's right.
They've except for a few well-organised areas like electricians, plumbers, and one or two others, where the unions have worked very closely with employers, and there's unions that are quite powerful. They've been able to keep up the proper training off the job and all for their apprentices, but in other industries, the employers just avoid it.
And governments have treated the TAFE sector abominably in recent decades.
And just one other element of that too, I think they're all integrated in a sense, is we should be making more demands, and that's where again, if we argued for more time off for learning and so on, and in other countries that often applies. I mean, so it's not unique. Is being able to access the university for resources. And see, in the US, I think there's 27 universities who have as their constitution, they have to have an extension program for workers and unions. I've had experience of quite a number of them, and some of them do great work, really good work.
A wonderful example is at the University of Washington, the Harry Bridges Centre for Labour Studies, which is named after a famous Australian chap who became secretary of the California, the International Longshoremen Workers Association.
So several of those are really good. That's the one in Cornell, the one at Oregon, in Eugene, University of Southern California, and they're quite independent, but the universities under their constitution have to fund them. Well, there's nothing like that here.
There used to be extension boards, didn't there, with at least Melbourne and Sydney?
Yes, and the extension boards worked with the Workers' Education Association, and there were tensions and conflicts around that relationship.
But it seems that one of the dilemmas that, coming back to what you were saying earlier too, Verity, about this sort of question of identity, if people aren't identifying as workers, then they're not going to be seeking out something that is kind of labelled as workers' education. So where do we go from here? What's it going to look like if people are not seeing themselves in the light that they once did?
Well, there's always a lag between identity and class formation. If you think of the 19th century, the engineers of the early 19th century were incredibly well paid and really did not think about the working class as a whole at all because they were so elite and so privileged. But by the end of the 19th century, they were the vanguard of the labour movement and using their power at the point of production to exert influence and put pressure on employers and to lead other workers. So, of course it takes time when a class is being formed in new areas and in new ways for identity to catch up, but it almost always does. I mean, if you look at what's happening in developing countries, the union density rates are increasing in those sorts of countries. Wherever capital shifts its investment, conflict follows it. So yes, we have seen a decline in labour militancy in developed economies as capital has moved offshore and set up production in places like China and Myanmar and so on. But what you see in those places, South Korea is a very good example, is a growing labour movement as those large-scale factories are set up and so on, and workers start to connect with each other. In Eastern Europe, you see really interesting and impressive new forms of labour militancy in parts of the world where it just hadn't existed before.
Actually, even locally, there's that interesting case of the menu log, the kind of identifying as a subcontractor or freelancer, or as opposed to an employee, and what that might mean, and in terms of conditions, and the whole notion of...
Absolutely, and those workers, they know that they're employees, whatever the legal subterfuge of Uber or Menulog or whatever might be. They know that they are being ripped off by an employer. And you can see that they are developing a consciousness of that, and they're starting to organise. The fast food worker, probably a typical worker of the 21st century, they are organising with each other through online technologies to put pressure on those global chains of, McDonald's and so on.
There's been one or two interesting examples in the US, quite creative unionism, where the Uber drivers in one city, the non-union, the union went in and helped them organise their own cooperative, so they would get the contract rather than Uber for a lot of the work, and they become a competitor of Uber very successfully. They all joined the union. The union then makes sure they're getting properly paid, and has helped them to help them run their co-op themselves. So they've democratised the ownership and the management. It's quite a creative way. And there was a similar one up in upstate New York, where a large group of black American women who were very poorly paid, the union, the SEIU, which is one of the good unions in the US, they helped them organise their own co-op. They're all non-union. They got the contract then for this was for home care. And the improvement was absolutely spectacular. They all joined the union. The union again helped them to develop and train them to run their own co-op. But the improvement in the service was something like 40 or 50%. The cost came down very significantly, and they went from about $7.50 an hour to $23.50 an hour, and got all those better results because they run the whole thing themselves. And the union was very creative thinking from the union. I mean, there's got to be a lot more of that, where the union plays a different kind of role, but still critical.
Yeah, and the Service Employees International Union that Max is rightly praising have also been very, very creative in the Fight for 15 campaign for the $15 minimum wage, and the way they've organised those strategic walkouts of minimum wage workers, coordinated in hundreds of workplaces all at once across North America. You don't actually need to have union representation in workplaces to do that. You just need a few militants here and there in each workplace, coordinated nationwide through online technology to walk out all at once. It gets huge publicity. Local councils are starting, particularly city councils, to mandate minimum wages we are a minimum wage city, they like to say, and so that puts pressure on the employers in that sort of indirect roundabout way. And the SEIU is saying, look, okay, we're not fighting to recruit union members necessarily, we are just fighting to improve the pay and condition of workers. And then, members might follow later. But it's education first. And YouTube videos are particularly important as a form of education around these campaigns.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but we have set aside a little bit of time for some questions from the audience. So in a moment, I'm going to invite Dr. Mary Leahy up to pass on some questions for you. But thank you for this really insightful conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Max.
Thank you.
We invited our registrants to pose some questions today, and so I'm drawing on those questions, and I'm just going to throw just a couple to draw out some of the points that were made in the earlier part of the conversation. So first of all, I've just been thinking about, and this came, as I said, out of one of the questions, that line between education and training and how it's changed over time. But particularly, what are the implications for social change movements? And Verity, if I could go to you first.
Well, I suppose an obvious distinction between education and training is that training is typically what employers want their employees to have. Trade skills at TAFE or on the job or in a private training college, whereas education is what movements tend to produce. The labour movement has funded and sponsored different forms of workers' education, as we've seen. But this is true of all social change movements, that they like to educate their own and also reach out to broader audiences. I think a very good example of a social movement educating is the women's movement's consciousness raising groups. I mean, the very name really kind of gets to the nub of what they were aiming at, that women sitting around and comparing their individual experiences of sexism and misogyny enabled the group as a whole to come to a higher level understanding that this was a collective problem, that it was embedded structurally and so on, and therefore come up with ideas about how best to contest it. But movements also, of course, often train their activists in how-to tactics, like how to organise a demonstration, how to organise a petition, etc., etc. So that's the equivalent of the more instrumental forms of training that the labour movement provides via things like the Trade Union Training Authority. So there's very, very clear parallels there. And of course the obvious point to make is that movements for change value education of their own and also to engage with the wider public.
Yeah. So almost social movement is education at its heart, is what you're saying. Max, did you want to add anything about how this might happen?
Yeah, look, just a couple of things. First, I think we need far more people who are really expert in adult learning, particularly workers learning, because it is quite different and you can't apply traditional education approach. When I was working in this regard, one of the first things I came across and had to work through was the whole idea of cognitive dissonance, and I would confront that in a seminar of shop stewards, because they come along already as adults, already with a whole lot of knowledge, prejudices, and so on, and I learnt that you couldn't pose an idea to them which was almost the opposite of what they believed, that they rejected. You had to learn to be able to pose a change in a way that they could grasp, and it was related to their experience. And that was a very important lesson. So you couldn't sort of, move from saying, well, look, to put it very simply, capitalism's a rat shit society, we should have something much better, because it wouldn't work. In fact, it would reinforce. So that was a very important lesson I learnt early on. The other thing was to try and finish giving people something practical to follow up with. That was often what they'd like, so that they'd learn some skills and learn maybe coming at something in a slightly different way, and they could have a project to go back in the workplace and work on. So you didn't leave it at the end of I'd nearly always try at the end of a shop steward's course, they all had some little job to do to follow up with, because that's how workers learn, in a very practical way, and then you build that into their system. Finally, just as an example of that, we once ran 60 shop stewards and officials, mostly shop stewards, at Clyde Cameron College, where we had some quite big input about the future of the food industry. We had all the unions there. And the idea was to get them to start to think about, over 4 days, the future of their industry. And of course, they knew better than most of their officials, not only their own workplace, but it was amazing the knowledge they had across their whole industry. And they very excitedly, and worked out, by the end of the week, we had a brilliant draft beginning to emerge. That was something, we'd had the bigger issues earlier in the week, but we brought it all down in the last day or so to them really concretely in cinder grips working out, wow, what are we going to do next week? And what do we want our industry to look like 5 years from now? In terms of its products, and they were concerned about the environment, they were often concerned about the food that they produced that wasn't healthy, etc., etc. And the fact that they took to that at the finish was a great learning experience. And in fact became a very important document where the unions were actually setting the agenda in the food industry. Until of course it all got knocked in the arse when we lost the election in '96. But it was a very important lesson of how you go about it, a very exciting lesson.
And interestingly, what you're talking about in the social movement and in the trade union movement in terms of drawing together knowledge and practical skills-based learning is actually what we are trying to achieve in education. And so it draws attention to perhaps some of the false dichotomies that we've set up around this aspect of education. But I wanted to follow up by with a question that came through about clearly there's still this thirst for knowledge, for understanding that we've seen drive all the different phases of worker education which you've discussed. And there is now the opportunity to use social media and the internet to go down rabbit warrens, to embrace some bizarre conspiracy theories, to enter into echo chambers. And so how can we address this hunger, this curiosity, in ways that actually build solidarity and a democratic society rather than the splintering that we've been seeing in Australia and elsewhere?
With the early days of all of this new technology, we were all thinking, oh, this is terrific, this will strengthen democracy and so on. And again, it's like the rest of the challenges about trying to take control and own these, the Facebooks and the like, democratically and challenge, because as long as they're owned and their sole purpose is to make a profit, they'll take a profit from anywhere, including the hard right. So it's sort of, in that sense, it's not a new struggle. In principle, it's the old struggle about how you challenge the system. It's just got a whole lot of new tactical elements to it which didn't exist in the past.
Well, I suppose we should ask, why has there been a growth in these sort of far-right echo chamber websites? What is making people lash out and blame the other instead of thinking about why are they poor and don't have good services and so on? Because what's really happened over the last 4 decades in around the world is that there's been a huge shift of income and capital from workers to corporations, an upward trickle. And so governments have cut back on providing good services, and of course there's been a lot of privatisation. So that's actually brought about a situation where unions and workers have actually much closer interests in common with citizens and consumers than they ever had. Because when you think about it, all workers and all consumers and all citizens have an interest in good wages, good public services, and of course capitalism is grinding down because workers are not paid well enough. We've all heard about the problem of sluggish wages growth. So there's actually greater potential for education that points out how much workers and citizens actually have in common.
And that potential for social coalition, and I guess education through that, how does that compare to what somebody has posed as the commodification of education? We have a plethora of choices through, the different types of education that you can access formally, but if we're thinking about what is on offer and then what this sort of broad social coalition could make use of, what is missing?
But that proliferation of private education providers is a classic example of the problem I was talking about. The mercantilisation of life, the privatisation of everything, the plundering of the commons for private gain. And so there is too much being provided. It actually requires reining in through government ownership or at least government regulation of those sectors, because those private providers basically rip off the public provision. You can draw parallels with nursing homes too. And I think we've seen in the pandemic that everybody is better off if there is strong, well-funded public provision of services, government oversight and regulation, and publicly owned utilities.
I mean, the big issue to me is not the fact that it is, education has been so privatised and so on, we know that. And the big issue is, what do we do about it? And I mean, a classic, great example is the Finnish education system, which was a hell of a mess in the mid-60s. But who led it was the Teachers' Union. In the mid-60s, they issued a magnificent paper, public discussion about what a good public education system should look like, built public support so that within about 5 years they were able to get appropriate legislation through. So the very important point, there were two important points. One, they set the agenda. The unions set the agenda, which is what we should be doing. Even when we're small, we should be out there setting the agenda, and the teachers' union should be doing that here. And I've been in discussions with them for a while, and they're about to tackle that, I'm pleased to say. Secondly, they knew they couldn't do it in a few years. They were looking 20 and 30 years ahead. And so what happens, by the mid-90s, the education system in Finland is regarded as about the best in the world. Teachers are paid in the top 10% of the pay scales. They have to have a master's. And what happened to the private schools? They've disappeared because they can't compete. Very impressive stuff. I mean, they're really concrete, both strategic, but each step's thought through in a concrete way.
It was a long-term plan, and it built coalitions, which is exactly what you've been talking about, Verity. And I think it also does point a way forward in the complexity of the problems we face, that with an understanding that education is at the heart of social movements, and that there is the potential for collaboration internationally, nationally, but across different organisations, that does provide a way forward to tackle these enormous problems that we're facing, such as climate change. Now, we could talk forever, and there is, of course, a time limit. So I'm going to thank you both for such a wonderful, rich discussion, teasing out really important issues around different types of education, which I know we can draw on, those of us in the formal sector must draw on to address a meaningful, non-commodified form of education that we need to offer, but that also can inform debates and discussions in the social movements, in the union movement, about how we address the challenges that we face. So I want to thank you both for your time and for your passion and for your inspiration, really, in the kinds of ideas you bring to us and the depth of knowledge that you bring. I also want to thank Alice, who really got this up and running and who did a wonderful job as moderator, and John for introducing the session and explaining the link with Fink and showing how this really pulls all the different ideas together. So, and finally, of course, to thank you, our audience, for participating in this. And I hope that you take much of it away to reflect on in the different aspects of your work and your activism in your communities. Thank you.